Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, something quiet, something that has existed for as long as humans have been dramatically complaining about mornings. Invisible labor. So dim the lights. Put your phone face down. Let the glow fade a little. Maybe pull the blanket up to your chin like you are a slightly dramatic medieval noble recovering from absolutely nothing. Tonight, we are not following kings into battle. We are not chasing queens through scandals. No one is dramatically fainting in candlelight. Instead, we're waking up before sunrise, long before the roosters, before the church bells, before the royal court has even begun deciding who to exile for minor awkwardness. We are stepping into the quiet, gray hour where most of history's work began. And almost no one wrote it down, because invisible labor rarely gets a parade. So let's drift back, slowly, no rushing. Imagine a medieval European town. The air is cold. The sky is still navy blue. It is somewhere around the 13th century. The noble family in their stone manor is asleep beneath heavy wool blankets. But in the kitchens below, someone is already awake. Of course they are. Because bread does not bake itself. Fire does not relight itself. And nobles, as history repeatedly demonstrates, do not make their own breakfast. The kitchen servant, likely a woman, maybe a teenage girl, rolls out of her straw mattress before dawn. She doesn't stretch luxuriously. She doesn't meditate. She doesn't journal about gratitude. She goes straight to work. First task: rekindle the hearth. The fire would have burned low overnight. Keeping it alive required skill. You preserved embers. You coaxed them back to flame. You did not have the convenience of clicking a stove knob and pretending you're a culinary genius. She blows gently into ash, feeds it small twigs, then thicker logs. The fire wakes up, reluctantly, much like her. This was daily, every single day. And here is the quiet irony. In many grand castles, the wealth of the household depended entirely on land, crops, livestock, all maintained by people who woke before sunrise. The lord of the manor might be addressed as, "Your Grace." The dairy maid, up in the dark milking cows, was addressed as, well, probably just shouted at. Let's float gently to the fields, because invisible labor did not stop at castle walls. Peasant farmers woke before the sun not because it was poetic, but because daylight was limited, especially in winter. And winter, in medieval Europe, was not charming. It was damp. It was muddy. It was the color beige. A farming family would rise in darkness. Children too. Yes, children. There is a modern fantasy that childhood used to be all skipping and wooden toys. It was not. If you were strong enough to carry something, you were strong enough to work. A boy of 7 might already be herding animals. A girl of 8 might already be spinning wool beside her mother. And spinning wool was not glamorous. It was repetitive. Hours of twisting fibers into thread. Hands roughened. Fingers cracked. Of course, no one painted grand portraits of the woman who successfully spun 200 yards of thread before breakfast. History prefers crowns, but cloth kept people warm. Thread held clothing together, and someone had to do it. Let's drift east for a moment to Imperial China, specifically the Tang and Song dynasties, because invisible labor was not a European hobby. It was universal. In many Chinese households, women rose before sunrise to begin grinding grain. Grinding grain meant pushing a heavy stone mill in circular motion, over and over and over. It was meditative. If by meditative we mean physically exhausting. Rice had to be cleaned, sorted, steamed. Clothes had to be washed in rivers. In winter. Yes, in winter. And here's the gentle, sleepy irony. Official historical records from imperial courts meticulously recorded astronomical events, court debates, tax reforms. But the woman freezing her hands in a river at dawn, not so much. Invisible labor rarely signs its name. Let's gently wander into a royal palace, because you might assume that queens did not wake early, that they floated out of bed sometime near noon, perfumed and glowing like Renaissance influencers. Sometimes, yes, but often, no. Take someone like Catherine of Aragon. Before she became the famously discarded wife of Henry VIII, and yes, we will glide into his chaos eventually, Catherine maintained a strict religious routine. She woke early for prayer, very early. Royal women were expected to embody discipline and piety. That meant long hours kneeling in chapel before the court even stirred. It was spiritual labor, emotional labor, dynastic labor. She needed to produce an heir, smile through miscarriages, appear serene. And here is the quiet tragedy. When she failed to give Henry a surviving son, history framed it as her shortcoming, as if biology were taking instructions from the Tudor throne. But she kept rising before sunrise. She kept praying. She kept presenting composure. Invisible labor sometimes looks like smiling politely while your husband contemplates replacing you. Let's slide north to Scandinavia. Long winters, late sunrises, cold that seeps into bone. In Viking households, women managed farms when men traveled, and men traveled often, raiding, trading, exploring, rebranding theft as maritime entrepreneurship. So the women rose early to manage livestock, oversee thralls, preserve food, mend sails. Archaeology shows keys buried with high-status Viking women. Keys to storehouses, to wealth. They were managers, administrators, but sagas focus on sword swings, because of course they do. Now, let's breathe and move forward a few centuries, into early modern Europe. By the 17th century, cities are growing. London smells questionable. Paris smells worse. Urban households relied on domestic servants. These servants slept in attics or near kitchens. They woke first. Always first. A maid in 1700s London might rise at 4 in the morning. She would light fires in every bedroom fireplace before the family awoke. Imagine quietly entering cold rooms, carrying coal scuttles, smudging soot on already chapped hands, all so that when the master of the house opened his eyes, warmth was waiting. He might later complain about politics over breakfast. He likely would not thank the girl who had been awake for hours, because invisible labor often hides in comfort. Let's float toward Versailles. Ah, Versailles, the palace of spectacle, the home of Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. Now, Louis famously turned waking up into theater. His lever ceremony involved nobles watching him rise from bed. There was a whole hierarchy of who could hand him his shirt. It was absurd. It was ritualized. It was deeply performative. But here is the softer layer. Dozens of servants were awake long before the Sun King staged his sunrise. Valets, chambermaids, cooks, cleaners. They prepared the spectacle. Louis was the sun. They were the orbiting planets. Exhausted planets. And here's the gentle humor. The king's morning routine required so many people that waking up became a group project. Meanwhile, a laundress somewhere in rural France was scrubbing linen in icy water before dawn, entirely unobserved. No audience, no applause, just soap and steam and aching shoulders. Let's drift to the Ottoman Empire. In Topkapi Palace, hundreds of women lived within the imperial harem. Popular imagination paints it as decadent lounging. Reality was structured, hierarchical, regulated. Young concubines trained relentlessly. Sewing, music, etiquette, religious study. They woke early. They practiced posture, speech, dance, because proximity to power required discipline. The Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, often rose before dawn for prayer and administrative review. She wielded real influence, but that influence required constant emotional management. Alliances, rivalries, surveillance. Invisible labor can be political. It can look like calculating which smile will preserve your son's throne. Let's take a breath. Now we glide toward industrial England, the 19th century. Factories, textile mills. The sun is barely rising when children walk to work. Yes, children again. A factory bell might ring at 5 a.m. Small bodies crawl under machinery to clear lint. Tie broken threads. Work 12-hour shifts. There is a peculiar sadness here. A quiet one. Because industrial wealth created new fortunes, new aristocracies. But the labor that fueled it began in darkness. And the official portraits of factory owners rarely included the underfed child who started before sunrise. Invisible labor does not oil paint well. Let's gently transition to domestic life in Victorian homes. Middle-class ideals celebrated the angel in the house, the devoted wife, the domestic goddess. She did not usually have paid employment, which meant her work was considered not work. She rose early to manage servants, plan meals, educate children, maintain social calendars, write letters. Emotional regulation was constant. Politeness was mandatory. If her husband succeeded, she was supportive. If he failed, she was discreet. She performed respectability before breakfast, and society called her idle. There is something almost impressive about how consistently history undervalues repetitive daily effort. Now let's widen the lens. Across continents, across centuries, waking before sunrise was the rule for the non-elite majority. Fishing communities launched boats in pre-dawn fog. Bakery apprentices kneaded dough by candlelight. Monks in monasteries rose for matins in the dead of night. Gregorian chant drifting through stone halls at 2 a.m. Spiritual labor, agricultural labor, domestic labor, all beginning in darkness. And here's the soft, sleepy irony. The sun rises eventually. It always does. By the time elites awaken, much of the essential work is already done. Food prepared, fires lit, animals fed, water hauled. The visible day rests on invisible mornings. So as we settle deeper into this quiet hour, notice the pattern. History often records declarations, coronations, wars, but it rarely records the person who woke first. And yet, civilizations depended on them. Every empire, every dynasty, every golden age. Someone, somewhere, was up before sunrise, lighting the first fire, grinding the first grain, whispering the first prayer, and no one wrote their name down. Let's gently continue drifting, because we have many more mornings to visit. Alright, let's settle back in. Maybe shift your pillow a little. Let your breathing slow down again. Because the sun still hasn't fully risen, and we have more quiet work to wander through. In part 1, we left off with the simple truth that empires rest on mornings no one applauds. And of course, that pattern does not improve as we move forward in time. If anything, it just gets more organized, more scheduled, more politely ignored. So let's drift into the 18th century again, but this time not into palaces first. Instead, we begin in the corridors outside them. Because even royalty, with all their embroidered pillows and dramatic self-importance, depended entirely on people who were awake before the crown even yawned. Imagine a grand European court. Let's say Vienna, or Madrid, or Dresden. The chandeliers are cold. The marble floors are quiet. But in service quarters tucked behind decorative walls, there is movement. Footsteps soft and practiced. Someone is already carrying hot water upstairs. Someone is polishing silver that will be used for a breakfast the king will barely taste. Someone is brushing crumbs off velvet chairs that cost more than a small farm. Take, for example, the court of Maria Theresa. She was formidable. Organized. The kind of ruler who actually read paperwork. Which already makes her unusual in the royal lineup. She woke early and worked long hours managing reforms, wars, children, so many children. 16, to be exact. Because apparently ruling half of Europe was not quite enough to stay busy. But even Maria Theresa's discipline rested on an entire ecosystem of invisible early risers. Ladies-in-waiting who dressed her. Secretaries who sorted correspondence before she ever saw it. Kitchen staff who prepared simple breakfasts while Europe negotiated itself into yet another diplomatic tangle. Her productivity required dozens of unseen hands. And while history applauds her reforms, it does not often pause to consider the laundresses scrubbing royal linens at dawn in icy courtyards. Now let's float westward to Britain. Because Britain perfected the art of making labor look dignified while ensuring it remained exhausting. In the Georgian era, large households ran on astonishingly precise routines. Housemaids rose at 5. Sometimes earlier. They emptied chamber pots before the family stirred. And yes, chamber pots are exactly what you think they are. Indoor plumbing was not yet universally reliable, and someone had to deal with the consequences of digestion. It was not glamorous. It was not poetic. It was absolutely necessary. Then came sweeping, dusting, laying fires in every grate, hauling coal up narrow staircases. Coal was heavy. Staircases were steep. Gratitude was minimal. The butler might have a polished presence, but even he was awake before sunrise, checking inventories, decanting wine, supervising footmen. And the footmen, in their decorative uniforms, stood ready long before breakfast conversations about Parliament began. The aristocracy prided themselves on leisure. But leisure is simply the visible surface of someone else's effort. It always has been. Let's glide gently into Spain. The Habsburgs, that gloriously inbred dynasty whose portraits become progressively more geometrically interesting over time. You cannot mention dynastic weirdness without eventually landing on Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. The final Habsburg ruler of Spain. A man so burdened by generations of strategic cousin marriage that he struggled with basic health throughout his life. He woke slowly. He required assistance to dress, to eat, to function. And while historians often focus on his jawline, because yes, the jawline is historically dramatic, what tends to fade into the background are the attendants who structured their entire lives around managing his fragility. Nurses. Servants. Courtiers who adjusted schedules to his health fluctuations. When he could not eat properly, someone prepared softened meals before sunrise. When he could not walk comfortably, someone supported him quietly down corridors that echoed with dynastic anxiety. His body became a political problem. But the people stabilizing that problem each morning remain nameless. And it is oddly consistent, isn't it? The more dysfunctional the monarchy, the more labor it required to maintain the illusion of stability. Which brings us gently to France again. Because France never does subtle dysfunction halfway. Consider Marie Antoinette. Much has been exaggerated about her. She did not actually say, "Let them eat cake," which feels like something she would have known better than to say aloud, but her lifestyle did require extraordinary maintenance. Hair alone was an architectural endeavor. Elaborate coiffures constructed with padding, powder, pomade. Someone was up before dawn preparing those towers of fashion. Seamstresses stitched gowns through the night. Servants warmed bathwater, arranged jewels, rehearsed etiquette. Meanwhile, outside Versailles, women rose in darkness to bake bread they could barely afford. The contrast is almost too obvious to mention, but we will anyway. Because it is quietly absurd. Let's drift toward Russia. The Romanovs. Cold winters. Heavy furs. Endless ritual. Even the Tsarina's day began with attendants adjusting garments layered like insulation against both weather and politics. In noble Russian households, serfs rose before sunrise to tend land owned by families who debated philosophy over tea. The agricultural calendar did not care about aristocratic introspection. Crops required attention at first light. Snow required clearing before carriages rolled. And when emancipation finally came in the 19th century, it did not magically erase the centuries of pre-dawn toil that had funded imperial grandeur. Now, breathe. Let's move slightly south, to Mughal India. Palaces like the Red Fort did not shimmer into operation on their own. Court life required cooks, water carriers, sweepers, scribes. In elite households, women observed purdah, living in seclusion, yet their days began early with prayer, textile management, food oversight. Even seclusion required maintenance. Curtains do not hang themselves. Intricate garments do not embroider themselves. Labor hummed beneath marble domes long before emperors made proclamations. Across the ocean, in colonial America, early rising was practically a personality trait. Puritan households considered idleness suspicious. So families rose before dawn to pray, then to work. Women churned butter in dim kitchens. Men headed to fields. Children fetched water. There is something almost rhythmic about it. Darkness. Movement. Firelight. Repetition. The quiet shuffle of daily survival. And despite the later national mythology of rugged independence, survival depended on communal effort. Someone always woke first. Even in monasteries and convents, that gentle echo of routine continued. Bells rang for matins in the early hours. Monks shuffled from narrow beds to cold stone chapels. Prayer before sunrise was not optional. It was the structure of the day. Devotion required discipline. And discipline required waking up while the world still slept. Now let's glide into the Industrial Revolution again, but this time slower. Because factories did not just demand early labor. They normalized it. Time became regulated by clocks rather than sun. Workers poured into mills while the sky was still gray. Women in textile factories worked looms for long hours after starting before dawn. Their fingers moved quickly, rhythmically, almost hypnotically. The hum of machines replaced the rooster. And in mining communities, men descended underground before sunrise and sometimes returned after sunset, their day defined by darkness on both ends. Invisible labor expanded. It became systemic. Scheduled. Industrial. And as we gently continue forward into the early 20th century, something interesting happens. Modern convenience begins to appear. Electricity. Indoor plumbing. Gas stoves. In theory, these innovations should have reduced labor. And in some ways, they did. But expectations rose to match them. Cleanliness standards increased. Meals became more elaborate. Efficiency became its own pressure. Women in middle-class households were still waking early, but now they were expected to manage increasingly complex domestic standards. Invisible labor did not vanish. It evolved. World wars reshaped mornings too. During wartime, women rose before dawn to work in factories producing munitions, to queue for rationed food, to manage households alone. Their husbands, brothers, sons away. Early rising became an act of endurance rather than routine. And after the wars, when societies attempted to return to normal, much of that labor quietly slid back into invisibility again. Because normalcy has a way of erasing the effort that sustained it. Now, as we lie here together in the soft present, consider how many centuries we've drifted through without ever fully escaping that first quiet hour. From medieval hearths to imperial courts, from rice mills to royal chapels, from spinning wheels to factory whistles, someone always wakes before the visible world begins. Someone prepares the conditions for comfort. And the pattern remains almost stubbornly consistent. The later you wake, the more likely your life appears important in historical records. The earlier you wake, the more likely your contribution dissolves into background noise. Of course, there are exceptions. There always are. But broadly speaking, the architecture of power rests on pre-dawn effort. So as this second part gently settles, notice how little has truly changed. We have electricity now. Alarm clocks. Smartphones that glow at 5 a.m. But bakers still rise before sunrise. Nurses begin shifts in darkness. Sanitation workers clean cities before commuters stir. Parents wake before children to pack lunches. And no one writes epic poems about it. Invisible labor remains the quiet scaffolding of civilization. And tomorrow morning, somewhere, someone will rise before the sun again. Not for glory. Not for applause. Hey guys, tonight we begin with cold stone walls, flickering torchlight, and a social ladder so rigid it could double as medieval spine support. So dim the lights. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe imagine you are wrapped in a heavy wool cloak that smells faintly of smoke and existential obligation. We are stepping inside the castle. Not the fairy tale version with cheerful singing birds and emotionally available princes. No. We are entering the real one. Drafty. Hierarchical. Intensely aware of who stands where, and who absolutely does not. Because inside medieval castles and manor houses, hierarchy was not just a suggestion. It was architecture. From the highest turret down to the lowest kitchen corridor, every person had a rank. A place. A carefully defined distance from power. And if you forgot your place, someone would gently remind you. Let's begin at the top. In a typical European castle, the lord ruled everything within those walls. Land. People. Livestock. Possibly even the weather, if he felt confident enough. He slept in the solar, a private chamber often positioned for warmth and light. Thick tapestries lined the walls. Not just for decoration, but insulation. Stone is charming until January arrives. If the lord was particularly important, like say William the Conqueror, his castle would be both fortress and administrative center. William did not just wake up and stretch. He woke into governance. Disputes over land. Taxation. Military obligations. Medieval inbox at full capacity. But even William's authority rested on layers beneath him. Let's drift slightly downward. The lady of the castle. Often romanticized. Often misunderstood. She was not lounging dramatically on velvet cushions all day. Well, not entirely. A high-born woman, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, wielded influence that was both visible and subtle. Eleanor was Queen of France. Then Queen of England. Because why settle for one kingdom when you can collect them like political souvenirs? She managed estates. Oversaw servants. Arranged marriages. Directed household finances. Inside her domain, hierarchy tightened. Below her stood the ladies-in-waiting. These were noble-born women. But not too noble. Important enough to attend her. Not important enough to outrank her. They dressed her. Accompanied her. Shared her daily life. And here is where the hierarchy becomes almost delicate. Even among ladies-in-waiting, rank mattered. Who handed the queen her gloves? Who walked closest during processions? Who poured wine? These details sound small. They were not. Proximity to power was currency. Now let's glide further down. Knights. Ah yes, the armored middle management of medieval society. Knights lived within castle walls when in service to a lord. They dined in the great hall. They trained in the courtyard. But they did not eat at the high table unless specifically invited. The high table was literal hierarchy. Elevated. Visible. Symbolic. The lord and lady sat above. Everyone else faced them. You could measure status in inches of elevation. Below knights were squires. Teenage boys training to become knights. Learning swordsmanship. Etiquette. How not to embarrass the family name. And squires performed labor too. They polished armor. Groomed horses. Assisted their knight in every possible way. Imagine waking before dawn to strap metal onto another human being because honor required it. Hierarchy often disguised servitude as training. Now let's quietly descend into the great hall itself. The hall was the social heart of the castle. Meals were eaten here. Announcements made. Celebrations staged. But seating arrangements were precise. Closest to the lord sat the most powerful vassals. Further down the table sat lesser retainers. At the very end, perhaps visiting merchants or lower status guests. Food distribution followed rank. The finest cuts of meat remained near the high table. Further down, portions grew simpler. Bread quality even shifted. White bread for elites. Dark, coarse bread for everyone else. Hierarchy was baked in. Literally. Let's slip behind the scenes. Through a narrow corridor. Down stone steps. Into the kitchen. Now we are in the lower hierarchy. Cooks rose before dawn. Kitchen boys fetched water. Scullery maids scrubbed pots large enough to bathe in. The head cook might wield considerable authority here. But that authority ended at the kitchen door. A cook could command assistance, but never contradict the steward, and certainly never question the Lord. Above the kitchen staff stood the steward. The steward was essentially the castle's operations manager. He kept financial records, supervised supplies, calculated rents from peasants outside the walls. He was educated, trusted, yet still not noble. A steward could become wealthy. He would not become aristocracy. Hierarchy had ceilings. Now let's move outward slightly, beyond the inner keep, toward the manor house structures. Because castles were not isolated towers of brooding nobility. They were centers of manorial systems. Outside lived peasants. Some free, many not. Serfs worked the lord's land in exchange for protection. And here is the quiet irony. The entire castle depended on those fields. The bread at the high table. The wine in polished goblets. The wool tapestries warming stone walls. All came from labor outside. Yet peasants rarely entered the castle interior. They might come for court hearings, tax obligations, religious ceremonies. But socially, they remained below the moat line. Hierarchy was geographic. The closer you lived to the central tower, the more important you were. It was medieval urban planning by ego. Now let's pause and float toward France again. Because French courts perfected hierarchy into performance art. At the palace of Louis XIV, rank was practically oxygen. The Sun King built Versailles not just as a palace, but as a hierarchy machine. Nobles competed for the honor of handing him his shirt. His shirt. Imagine entire aristocratic families maneuvering politically for the privilege of assisting a man into sleeves. But proximity meant influence. And influence meant survival. Versailles operated on etiquette codes so intricate they resembled choreography. Who entered rooms first? Who sat on chairs versus stools? Who remained standing? Every gesture reinforced rank. Meanwhile, servants moved quietly along back corridors, ensuring the spectacle functioned. They memorized routines. They avoided eye contact. They remained invisible by design. Hierarchy inside Versailles was so strict that even nobles were trapped by it. If you were not favored, you lingered in decorative irrelevance. Now let's drift toward Spain again. The Habsburg court. A dynasty famous for its commitment to keeping marriage strictly within the family tree. Which, as we know, did not always produce the healthiest results. Inside the court of Charles II of Spain, hierarchy existed alongside fragility. Charles required assistance for daily tasks. So attendants rose in carefully ranked order. Senior courtiers managed access. Lower servants managed logistics. Even illness obeyed protocol. If the king felt unwell, information moved through layers. No one spoke directly without clearance. Hierarchy protected dignity. And occasionally obscured reality. Let's gently wander into England once more. The Tudor court. Because few environments were more aware of rank than the court of Henry VIII. Henry's personality filled rooms. His hierarchy filled buildings. Access to the king determined everything. Nobles positioned themselves strategically during hunts, during banquets, during morning rituals. And beneath them, layers of servants ensured Henry's lifestyle remained uninterrupted. Yeomen of the guard stood watch. Grooms managed horses. Pages carried messages. Every corridor had order. Every door had gatekeepers. You could not simply wander into royal presence, unless you wanted your social existence gently erased. Now, let's step away from European courts for a moment. Hierarchy was not exclusive to castles. In feudal Japan, samurai households operated with rigid order. At the top stood the daimyo. Below him, senior retainers. Below them, lower-ranking samurai. Below them, servants. Each level followed codes of conduct. Speech differed by rank. Body posture differed by rank. Even eye contact was regulated. Hierarchy entered daily life like choreography. In many manor houses across Europe, hierarchy extended into sleeping arrangements. The lord and lady had private chambers. Important guests received private rooms. Lesser servants slept in shared quarters. Some near kitchens for warmth. Some in attics. Comfort scaled downward. Privacy did too. And through it all, children absorbed rank like air. Noble children learned early who they outranked. Peasant children learned early whom to avoid. Hierarchy was not explained. It was modeled. Reinforced daily. Now as we settle into this rhythm, notice something quietly fascinating. Strict hierarchy provided structure. But it also created constant tension. Everyone wanted to rise slightly higher. To move one seat closer to the high table. To earn one more inch of elevation. And because upward mobility was limited, competition simmered quietly beneath politeness. In castles and manor houses, your identity was not simply who you were. It was where you stood. Where you sat. Whom you served. And who served you. The walls were stone. But the real structure was social. Rigid. Layered. Unquestioned. And oddly, efficient. Because when everyone knows their place, routines run smoothly. Meals appear on time. Announcements echo correctly. Ceremonies unfold without chaos. But the cost of that smoothness was constant awareness. Of rank. Of status. Of distance. So as the torches flicker low and the castle settles into night again, remember this. Behind every throne was a staircase. Behind every high table, a lower bench. Behind every noble title, a long line of people who knew exactly how far back they stood. And tomorrow morning, when the castle wakes, it will wake in order. From the bottom up. As it always did. We'll continue drifting through these layered worlds next time. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft. Not soft like pillows. More like, softly disappointing human behavior across several centuries. So dim the lights. Let the room go a little darker. Maybe imagine you're sitting inside a very drafty medieval hall, but you personally are warm and extremely unthreatened. Because tonight, we're talking about punishments. Loyalty. Survival. Not the dramatic sword-swinging kind. The quiet kind. The kind where everyone smiles politely while calculating whether they will still have a head, a title, or a bedroom by next Tuesday. Because inside royal courts and elite families, loyalty was everything. And also, completely fragile. Let's start gently in medieval England. In the 12th century, kings did not enjoy disloyalty. Shocking, I know. Take Henry II of England. Intelligent. Energetic. Slightly controlling. He built legal reforms that shaped English common law. He also had a family that treated loyalty like a casual suggestion. Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was wealthy, politically sharp, and absolutely not inclined to sit quietly in the background. Together, they produced several sons. And like many royal sons, those boys developed ambitions. Because when your father owns half of France and England, it's very hard to remain humble. Eventually, Henry's sons rebelled against him. Encouraged, quietly, by Eleanor. Because of course she did not simply knit by the fireplace. Now here's the gentle irony. Henry had spent years building systems of loyalty across his kingdom. Vassals swore oaths. Barons pledged fealty. Everything rested on sworn allegiance. And yet his own household became the epicenter of betrayal. Punishment followed rebellion. Eleanor was imprisoned for years. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just quietly confined. Because medieval punishment was often about containment rather than spectacle. You remove the threat. You isolate it. You survive another day. Let's float forward slightly. Because loyalty in royal families rarely improves over time. Drift with me to the Tudor court. Specifically, the court of Henry VIII. Henry valued loyalty. Until he didn't. Courtiers learned quickly that survival meant reading the king's mood like a weather forecast. Cloudy with a chance of execution. But we are not focusing on drama tonight. We're focusing on the quiet tension. Imagine being a nobleman at Henry's court. You wake each morning aware that yesterday's favor can evaporate by afternoon. You smile. You flatter. You agree. Loyalty becomes performance. Thomas More believed in principle over compliance. He paid for that. But many others adapted. They shifted religious positions when Henry broke from Rome. They nodded when he remarried. They rewrote their own beliefs in real time. Because survival inside court hierarchy required flexibility. And perhaps a mild absence of personal conviction. Now let's gently drift to Spain. Because no discussion of loyalty feels complete without visiting the Habsburgs. Specifically, Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. The product of extensive dynastic intermarriage. Physically fragile. Frequently ill. And surrounded by factions competing for influence. Loyalty to Charles often meant loyalty to whichever advisor currently controlled access to him. Court politics became layered. Ministers undermined one another. Foreign powers whispered promises. Charles himself struggled to assert consistent authority. Punishment in this environment was rarely loud. It was administrative. A title revoked. A posting reassigned. An invitation quietly withdrawn. And in a court obsessed with hierarchy, losing access was a kind of social disappearance. You could be technically alive and politically invisible. Which, in many royal courts, amounted to the same thing. Let's drift northward to Russia. Because Russian loyalty carried its own chilly undertones. Under Ivan IV, often remembered as the Terrible, loyalty was demanded absolutely. Ivan's childhood was unstable. He grew up surrounded by boyars who maneuvered for control. Distrust became his default setting. So when he ruled, he created the Oprichnina. A separate territory and loyal force devoted only to him. This was loyalty institutionalized. If you were suspected of disloyalty, consequences followed. Sometimes severe. But again, let's keep this calm. Imagine the atmosphere rather than the action. Courtiers moving carefully. Voices lowered. Glances calculated. Survival meant not standing out too brightly. Not aligning too strongly with the wrong faction. Not speaking too freely. And the irony? Ivan's paranoia created the very instability he feared. Distrust multiplies. Let's float gently toward France. Because loyalty there often came wrapped in silk stockings. Under Louis XIV, loyalty was less about fear and more about dependency. Louis centralized power at Versailles. He required nobles to live near him. To attend elaborate rituals. To participate in his daily schedule. Why? Because if nobles were busy competing for ceremonial privileges, they were not plotting rebellion in distant provinces. It was brilliant. And slightly exhausting. Punishment under Louis often took the form of exclusion. You might find yourself no longer invited to intimate gatherings. No longer granted key offices. Your social light dimmed. Survival meant constant visibility without overstepping. A delicate dance. Now let's glide toward the Ottoman Empire. Within Topkapi Palace, loyalty revolved around proximity to the Sultan. The Janissaries, elite military units, were trained from youth to serve the empire. Their loyalty was engineered. Structured. But even structured loyalty can crack. When sultans appeared weak, factions emerged. Grand viziers rose and fell. And punishment, again, often involved quiet removal from influence. Court survival depended on alliances. On reading shifting power currents. On knowing when to step back. Now breathe. We'll move to Imperial China. Under the Ming dynasty, emperors relied on scholar officials selected through rigorous examinations. Merit-based loyalty. In theory. In practice, court factions developed. Eunuchs held influence. Confucian officials guarded tradition. If you criticized the emperor too directly, you risked exile. If you flattered too obviously, you risked ridicule. The balance was delicate. Punishment could mean reassignment to distant provinces. Far from court life. Far from influence. A bureaucratic fade into obscurity. Let's pause on that. Obscurity as punishment. In many elite societies, the greatest fear was not physical harm. It was irrelevance. To be removed from the center. To lose proximity. To fade. Now let's gently shift toward loyalty inside royal families. Because betrayal rarely required external enemies. Take Peter the Great. Peter modernized Russia aggressively. He valued efficiency. He distrusted opposition. His own son, Alexei, resisted Peter's reforms. Their relationship deteriorated. What followed was not a dramatic duel. It was interrogation. Pressure. An unraveling of familial loyalty under political weight. Dynastic survival sometimes overrode paternal affection. And this pattern appears repeatedly across monarchies. The crown rarely tolerates dissent, even from blood. Let's float toward Britain again. The Hanoverian dynasty. Specifically George I of Great Britain. George spoke limited English. His court operated partly in German. Loyalty in his reign meant navigating cultural awkwardness alongside political expectation. Ministers like Robert Walpole rose by demonstrating reliability. Not charisma. Not brilliance. Steady loyalty. In constitutional monarchies, survival began shifting. Loyalty to the crown blended with loyalty to parliament. Punishments became less personal, more political. Loss of office rather than loss of liberty. Hierarchy evolved. But tension remained. Now let's drift softly into the 19th century. Napoleon's court. Because loyalty to Napoleon Bonaparte was built on success. As long as he won, loyalty held. When fortunes changed, allegiance wavered. Marshals who once pledged eternal devotion began calculating futures. Punishment became exile. Titles revoked. Fortunes reshuffled. Napoleon himself would experience the ultimate form of political fading. Removed from the center. Placed on islands. Twice. Even emperors are not immune to the slow erosion of loyalty. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson threading through centuries. Loyalty in elite circles was rarely unconditional. It was transactional. Strategic. Carefully maintained. Punishment was often subtle. A shift in seating. A withdrawal of favor. An appointment elsewhere. Survival meant adaptability. Reading rooms. Understanding mood. Sensing danger before it spoke aloud. So as we settle into this dim hall of history, notice how calm it all feels from a distance. Centuries blur. Thrones rise and fall. But inside each court, each palace, each manor house, individuals wake each morning calculating their position. Am I safe? Am I favored? Am I still included? Punishment, loyalty, survival. Not always dramatic. Often quiet. Layered. Human. And as the candles burn lower, the castle settles. Tomorrow, the hierarchy resumes. Oaths will be spoken. Smiles exchanged. Alliances reconsidered. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quieter than usual. Softer. A little gentler around the edges. So go ahead and dim the lights. Let the room settle. Maybe pull the blanket a bit closer and let your breathing slow down. Imagine candlelight flickering against stone walls. A distant echo of footsteps in a corridor. The world outside your window fading into the background. Tonight, we're not focusing on battles or dramatic downfalls. No shouting. No swords. No thrones dramatically toppling in thunderous storms. Instead, we're drifting through the small spaces in history. The private corners. The little dreams people carried inside heavy crowns. Because even kings and queens, especially kings and queens, had quiet hopes. Tiny joys. And a surprising amount of silent resilience. Let's begin in 16th century Spain. With Philip II of Spain. Philip ruled an empire so large that the sun allegedly never set on it. Which sounds impressive. And exhausting. He inherited vast territories. Gold from the Americas. Endless paperwork. Enemies. Religious tension. But here is the softer detail people forget. Philip loved order. He built El Escorial, a palace monastery complex that was austere and symmetrical. Clean lines. Simple stone. A place that felt controlled. Because his life was not. Philip lost multiple wives. Children died young. His son Don Carlos struggled deeply and unpredictably. Publicly, Philip was rigid. Devout. Serious. Privately, he surrounded himself with paintings. Relics. Letters from daughters he adored. He liked to work alone late into the night. Reading dispatches carefully. Writing responses in his own hand. There's something almost tender about that. An emperor, surrounded by global chaos, finding comfort in neat stacks of documents and symmetrical architecture. His dream was stability. His joy was quiet order. And in that silence, he endured. Now let's gently float north to France. To Louis XVI. He is often remembered as indecisive. Overwhelmed. Awkward. Which, yes. But let's slow down and look at him as a person. Louis enjoyed locksmithing. Actual locksmithing. He spent hours working with metal tools, crafting locks and keys. Of all the hobbies available to a king of France, falconry, elaborate hunts, dramatic displays of power, he chose mechanical puzzles. There is something deeply human about that. While Versailles glittered around him, while courtiers whispered and France strained under financial pressure, Louis found small joy in shaping metal into something precise. He was not built for theatrical leadership. He was called to it anyway. His resilience was quiet. Sometimes frustratingly so. He tried reforms. Hesitated. Retreated. Tried again. He was not the most decisive ruler. But in his workshop, surrounded by tools, he was calm. A king who preferred locks to speeches. And perhaps, in a gentler world, that would have been enough. Let's drift over to Austria. To Empress Elizabeth of Austria, often called Sisi. She is remembered as beautiful. Restless. Tragic. But beneath the mythology was a young woman who felt deeply trapped. Sisi married young. into the Habsburg court. A place of rigid etiquette and suffocating hierarchy. She struggled with court life almost immediately. Her small joys were unconventional. She rode horses for hours. Rode hard. Fast. She wrote poetry late at night. Often melancholic. Sometimes sharp. She exercised obsessively. Maintained strict beauty routines that bordered on ritual. Her resilience came through movement. Through escape. Through finding pieces of herself outside palace walls. And while history frames her life as tragic, and it certainly carried sorrow, it also held quiet defiance. She traveled frequently. Pushed against protocol. Sought solitude in places where she could breathe. Even within rigid dynastic expectation, she carved out slivers of autonomy. Now let's float eastward to Russia. To Nicholas II of Russia. Nicholas is often portrayed as unprepared for rule. And that assessment is fair. But in private diaries, Nicholas appears almost ordinary. He loved his family deeply. He noted weather patterns. Described walks. Recorded small details about his children. He found joy in quiet domestic evenings. In playing with his daughters. In structured routines. While the empire strained around him, Nicholas retreated into family life. Some call it avoidance. Perhaps it was. But it was also a form of coping. His resilience took the shape of denial, yes. But also devotion. In a palace surrounded by ceremony, he cherished simple meals and private laughter. He was not emotionally suited to revolution. But he was deeply suited to fatherhood. And sometimes, history punishes those mismatches. Now let's gently move further back. To medieval England. To Henry VI of England. Henry VI was gentle. Soft-spoken. Devout. Not exactly the energy one expects from a medieval king during political turbulence. He founded educational institutions. Eton College. King's College, Cambridge. He preferred prayer and learning to power games. Henry experienced periods of mental instability. Long silences. Withdrawals. But even during instability, he maintained small routines. Religious devotion. Charity. He seemed happiest not on a throne, but in chapel. History labels him weak. Perhaps he was simply misplaced. A scholar born into a crown. His resilience was passive. Enduring storms he did not summon. Finding peace in scripture while nobles argued. Now let's drift to Mughal India. To Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan is often associated with grandeur. Marble palaces. Monumental architecture. But behind the Taj Mahal was a man deeply grieving. He loved Mumtaz Mahal intensely. Her death shook him. For years, he withdrew into mourning. His small joy became construction. Architecture as memory. Symmetry as solace. He channeled grief into design. White marble. Balanced gardens. Perfect geometry. There's something almost meditative in that. Building permanence in response to loss. His resilience was artistic. Structured. Beautiful.
Now let's glide to Britain again. To Queen Victoria. Victoria projected authority. Empire expanded under her name. But privately, she was deeply emotional. Her marriage to Prince Albert brought genuine happiness. After his death, she withdrew for years. Wore black. Avoided public appearances. Her small joys centered around family. Around letters. Around memory. She kept Albert's rooms preserved. Daily routines maintained as if he were still present. Some called it excessive. But grief does not follow tidy timelines. Her resilience looked like ritual. Like holding on to love in structured ways. And slowly, gradually, returning to public life. Now let's float to a slightly different kind of royal. Marie Antoinette. Often reduced to caricature. But she loved simple pastoral fantasies. She built a small hamlet at Versailles. Played at shepherdess. Wore lighter dresses. Sought simplicity within extravagance. It was naive, yes. But it reveals something. Even queens crave uncomplicated joy. She found comfort in gardens. In informal gatherings. In music. Her resilience was escapist. But it was human. Across continents and centuries, we see this pattern. Grand titles. Heavy expectations. And inside them, very small, very human dreams. A king who likes metalwork. An empress who writes poetry. A czar who adores bedtime stories. A ruler who builds monuments to grief. History often flattens these figures into symbols. Villain. Hero. Failure. Icon. But in their private chambers, they were simply people managing pressure. Finding joy where they could. Sometimes in hobbies. Sometimes in children. Sometimes in symmetry. Sometimes in silence. And that silent resilience is oddly comforting. Because it reminds us that power does not erase vulnerability. It amplifies it. The crown does not remove loneliness. It can intensify it. Yet even within rigid courts, strict hierarchy, and relentless expectation, these individuals carved out moments of softness. Small rituals. Private passions. Little dreams. And tonight, as we drift through candlelit corridors and marble halls, perhaps that is the quiet thread holding everything together. Not the wars. Not the policies. But the simple human instinct to find something gentle inside something heavy. To endure. Softly. We'll continue this slow wandering next time. There are many more quiet hearts hidden behind crowns.